Nigel Farage, you're the father of Brexit, one of the best known and most familiar and popular faces on British television, instantly recognized in many other countries as well, including the United States. Your uniquely winning personality, presentation, and common sense candor have brought you close to world leaders and all sorts of major figures in all walks of life. And it's this that compels me to ask you whether you believe, and if you do, why you think we have such a vacuum of good leadership in the Western world at the present time. This dreadfully frustrating and worrying situation is one of the major narratives of our current days.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the main reasons is this. If you go back, through previous decades and look at leaders that we produced in, let's say, America and the United Kingdom to begin with, you find leaders who, before embarking upon political careers, had done other stuff. They'd been in business. They'd risen up through the ranks of the trade union movement. They'd, in General Eisenhower's case, commanded the D-Day operation. I mean, these were people of real substance who then went into politics later in life thinking that they might be able to give something back. Now, some of them turned out to be good leaders, and some of them turned out to be completely rubbish. But have a look at today's generation of leaders. I mean, Joe Biden has been on Capitol Hill for half a century. I mean, there isn't much life outside of politics and the games of politics. And you look at the sort of prime ministers that we've had in the United Kingdom, nearly all Oxford University, nearly all viewing politics actually as a career as opposed to a calling. And you see, if you go into politics and aim at political leadership, well, there are two types of people that do it. There are those who want to be something, and that means rank, title, position, and respect as they see it among their peers. And then there are those that want to do something. And those that want to do something couldn't give a damn what anybody in the capital cities thinks of them, don't care about criticism from the New York Times or the Guardian or the BBC or CNN. They actually couldn't care less. They can live in the modern world with the abuse that gets heaped on them from all forms of social media. So I think a lot of this is about the motivations of those that lead our countries. And I think that's where we've gone horribly, horribly wrong.
I think that's an excellent point. It's the motivation. And even for those people, I suppose, with motivation, it's the experience base. If they haven't got it, however large they dream, Liz Truss is probably a good example. They're not going to get it right, are they? Because they don't really know what they're doing.
No, I mean, that's right. However, I will say in Liz Truss's case that her instincts in terms of where she wanted us to go were right. She was hated by the IMF, the White House, the civil service blob in Westminster, the media. How dare she? Do you know what she wanted to do? She wanted to reduce the size of the state. I mean, goodness gracious me, we can't have that now, can we? She wanted to reduce taxation. Oh, that would never do. Oh, and worse still, she wanted to incentivize ordinary men and women to set up their own businesses and succeed. Well, we couldn't have any of that. And here's the irony. The financial markets crisis that led to her resignation, gilt yields today are higher than they were at the time of Liz Truss's resignation. And I'm listening, I'm waiting for the IMF to say something. No, not a word. So, having real life experience not only equips you to deal with difficult things in life, but there's something else here. It gives you a connection with ordinary people.
Yes.
Rather than a connection with the bubbles that exist inside DC and London, where you only speak to people who nearly always come from the same class, the same school, the same university, the same background, and the same ambitions. And this has happened right across the Western world, where the debates that take place inside the Beltway, for argument's sake, are very different to what ordinary folks care about when the family is sitting around having breakfast, talking about what concerns them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's true. If Liz Truss had ever had a job turning around a business that was failing, bringing it to profit, she might have planned to do things a bit differently. She really did set herself up and stood right at the edge of the cliff. And it was pretty easy for all the powers that you mentioned, together with their hedge fund and other friends, to push her off the cliff. But in the big stories, moving on a bit, America is going to obviously get through the debt ceiling mess, as it always does. Why do they always do this? This is what everybody asks. But what's going to happen about immigration, Nigel? That's a much trickier question. It's a huge issue there, as it is here, with as many as 13,000 people a day coming across America's southern border. Biden has really failed. And forgive me for just going on, but I want to get this question in. And I noticed that CNN, the New York Times, and even Eric Adams, the Democratic mayor of New York, where it seems all the hotel rooms are now filled with migrants. And he's saying, please send these people to every state in the union. Why do they all need to come to Manhattan? They're all having a go at old Joe. Do you think they're setting him up to get his own people, to get rid of him before the election?
Well, quick point on the debt ceiling. Yes, of course, it'll be agreed. It always is. And debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're all hooked on fiat money. Ever since Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, we have been devaluing money consistently and printing money, and that is why we have inflation in our systems. Inflation is a disease of money caused by government. Now, what is happening on the southern border and what is happening in the English Channel with illegal immigration is something that is a deep insult, not just to long-established families, but here's the interesting point, to those that have legally come to our countries and gone through the process over the course of the last couple of decades. Because, you know, they've done things properly, they paid the price to do it, and here are people just walking in and being allowed to stay. The numbers on America's southern border, I mean, they're just mind-blowing. They're astonishing. And whilst, of course, within that number, there will be those who are perfectly decent people who want a better standard of life and see America as the beacon they want to come to, just as they see the UK, by the way, in Europe, as the beacon that they want to come to. Also, among that, are people about whom the American government has no idea at all. It's an open door for criminality. It's an open door for gangs. It's an open door, frankly, for the already rapidly declining levels of law and order in America's big cities to simply get worse. Now, we've been filling hotels up all over the country, much to the anger of everybody. And once I heard that New York hotels were now filling up, I thought, there might just be a change of sentiment. Because you see, it's all very easy for the great and the good to say, I can't see what the problem is. You wait till it's on their doorstep. They start taking a very different attitude. And it sounds like Eric Adams might just be waking up to what the implications of this are. I would have thought that in the minds of fair-minded Americans, these millions coming into the country illegally should be a very major election issue in November 2024. And I would point everybody to what the solution might be. You know, this is not just the council of despair that we're talking about here. Australia faced the same problem back in the earlier parts, you know, sort of early 2000s, suddenly boats filled with hundreds of people were coming from Indonesia. They tried all sorts of solutions. They tried offshore processing, etc. In the end, a very brave and principled conservative leader called Tony Abbott said, right, I'm going to deal with this. He put adverts out all over Indonesia saying no one that comes to Australia illegally through the traffickers via this route will ever be allowed to stay, ever be allowed to stay. And when some people thought he wasn't serious, do you know what he did? He towed the boats back to Indonesia. He used the Australian Navy to tow the boats back to Indonesia. And of course, the UN went mad, the EU went mad, everybody condemned Australia. It was now a pariah state, and how dare they? And the churches condemned him. But you know what happened? The boats stopped coming. They stopped coming. Literally, they completely and utterly stopped coming. So the only way you can deal with illegal immigration is to make it perfectly clear that nobody that comes via this route will ever be able to stay. And quite why in America you have this lunacy of sanctuary cities, I will simply never, ever know. But for the Republicans to win the election, they have to reach the center ground of public opinion. And the center ground of public opinion objects to this stuff. And I think it's up to Trump, DeSantis, whoever it is, I think it'll be Trump, but it's up to them to come up with a credible plan as to how you start to use deportations and to stop the incentive of getting into America illegally. And I think, you'll find, however mad we think the world is at times, whether it's gender ideology or whatever it may be, that actually in the Western world, there is still a clear, settled majority for common sense. Now, as far as Biden's concerned, I have little doubt that they will knock him out towards the end of this process. I just don't see, he's a useful puppet, I get that, but I just don't see, particularly by the way, if you're in the green industry and want massive state subsidies, Biden's great, but I just don't see them going into an election with somebody, in his physical and mental state. I just don't see it being allowed. So yeah, I think setting the guy up to fail, I'm almost certain there'll be a last-minute replacement.
There's probably some conflict. I guess those people who see Biden as Obama's third term would reckon that those forces will do everything to keep him in place. But I think you're right. And I think you're right that Trump will certainly, drag the boats back to Indonesia or wherever. Whether the government here would do such a thing, it's anybody's guess. But what do you think will happen, immigration aside, before the next presidential election, and what will the outcome be and how will that change things, Nigel?
Well, a lot will depend on the international situation. A lot will depend on how much China is perceived to be a threat, and who knows how things are going to play out in Ukraine. But I mention that because it's almost like now Putin is almost China's proxy, as I see it. We put sanctions on Putin. He needed to find new markets. China said, thank you very much indeed. There is the persistent threat, of course, of an invasion of Taiwan. Biden is seen to be much friendlier towards China than Trump is. And I think that's a pretty fair assessment of the situation. So the international situation will matter. Domestically, it's interesting. DeSantis the other night with his rather, should we call it, staccato launch on Twitter, which is not his fault, but there we are. I think the war on woke, the stuff our kids are being taught in schools, and Youngkin winning the governorship in Virginia, very much on that issue. These things are important, but I think it would be a mistake for the Republican Party to focus too much on the culture wars. I think at the end of the day, what Bill Clinton and Dick Morris said between them all those years ago, it's the economy, stupid. Actually, it is, isn't it? Because what do most average families, what's their biggest source of concern? It's what's the electricity bill going to be? Can we afford to go on a proper holiday this year? My goodness me, look at what the college fees are going to be for little Billy. These are the things that really matter on a day-to-day basis. And so as I say, whilst I think the culture wars need to be fought, and it's very important that we do, and I hate the fact our kids are being poisoned at schools and universities, but I do think what happens in the economy ultimately is going to be the election winner or loser for the Republican Party. And they need to have a credible plan that says we're going to get America back to growth. Growth is the key to all of this, and this is where I feel that Trump is actually quite well placed to say to the American public, look, hey, you know what? Were you better off under me than you are now? And I think the answer is likely to be yes.
He put more money in Americans' pockets than any president. With all the negativity, there are those facts. Yeah. Let me ask you, in the UK, the British Conservative government has obviously, totally abysmally failed on its promise to control immigration after 13 years in power, and with the marvelous wonder tool of Brexit to do the trick. And despite all this, like politicians in every country these days, they keep gaslighting us about how great everything is and how well we're doing. But I really don't think people believe it at all anymore. What would you have done, Nigel, regarding Brexit and immigration if you'd had a seat at the table? And notwithstanding, what would you do right now?
Well, look, I mean, the thing is that we got the Brexit result. There was a mechanism we had to trigger to give instructions to the EU we were leaving. It was called Article 50. We should have triggered Article 50 the next morning. No, we waited for 2 years. Waited for 2 years to give notice to leave, which of course allowed all the globalist forces against us to build their strength. That then put the governing Conservative Party, who of course had been against Brexit, but it put them in a very weak position. What Brexit was, it was an instruction from the voters to government to turn the ship of state around by 180 degrees, to go in a completely different direction. And if you're making a fundamental change in life, whether it's a change of relationship, a change of house, whatever it may be, unless you believe in what you're doing, it's going to be a failure. You actually have to have conviction. And the problem is the Conservatives never believed in it. They didn't view it as an opportunity. They viewed it as a damage limitation exercise. We now have total control of our borders, and yet net migration is through the roof. Our population has increased. I mean, remember how small we are. Our population has increased from 60 to 68 million in the last 20 years, and 85% of that growth is through immigration. I mean, you can't drive on our roads anymore. You can't get a doctor's appointment, and your kids can't get houses. I mean, that's where we are. We are going through, our little island is going through a dramatic population crisis, and it doesn't really matter anymore whether it's Labour in power or Tories in power. They're addicted to cheap foreign labour because that's what the giant multinational businesses want. So, look, on the immigration front, that would have been easy. On the business regulation point, the EU is an over-regulated, socialized model. Again, you could have scrapped thousands of laws. There was, in fact, a piece of legislation proposing the scrapping of 4,000 EU laws, and Rishi Sunak's government has just ditched it. So, basically, you have to have leaders. We're really back to where we started, aren't we? You have to have leaders who actually believe in what they're doing. So if I was there, things would change radically. But I'm in a funny position because if I was in a European country, I'd have been deputy prime minister, at least deputy prime minister, because the electoral system of proportionality would have put me there. If we were in America, if I was in America, where we had a presidential system, I could have run. I might not have won, but I certainly would have shaped the agenda. But I'm politically caught in sort of the worst of all worlds, where I've won 2 national elections to the European Parliament under proportionality. But to break the first past the post stranglehold of Labour and Conservative, well, all I can do really is what Ross Perot did. So I'm in a very difficult position. I might be the father of Brexit. I might have forced the establishment into it, but they don't let me control any of the levers. So as you can imagine, I'm pretty frustrated by it all.
We'll come to that in a second. I want to ask you first about Ukraine. What do you think, what do you say will or should happen there, Nigel? And a bit far out, but I'd also like to ask, what do you think would happen if the growing narrative, as I see it and others see it, that President Putin could resort to tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and even against the UK and other European nations, as quite a few people are talking about, proves to be the case? How would the US government address that, and how would our own government here in the UK address that?
First things first, I think the endless expansion of NATO and the European Union was a long-term strategic error, but none of that forgives the behavior of Putin and his forces that we've seen over the course of the last year. None of it. I think that we have a military stalemate that will go on as it is for years and years to come, with a huge loss of life on both sides. I'm astonished that no Western leader has really tried to broker a peace deal of any kind. I know Boris Johnson's just been in Texas saying Ukraine will win. Well, maybe Ukraine will win, but history suggests that when the Russians' backs are against the wall, they kind of win through whatever the cost. And Putin has managed to build this narrative in Russia that the West's against them, the West's the enemy. If we give in, we'll lose everything. So look, I sense in America that public opinion is tiring of endlessly supplying arms. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not to say. But I do think we need to at least attempt some sort of negotiated peace. Would Putin go as far as using nuclear weapons? Yes, of course, London very much threatened because, we very much, the Brits under Boris took the lead on Ukraine. Yeah. Everybody else followed.
Yeah, we were his worst enemy.
Incidentally, without Brexit, we couldn't have done that. So the right to govern yourselves means you can make good decisions or bad decisions. But
it's all your fault.
Well, of course, everything is. We were freed to do that. I tell you what, I think that Putin is now effectively a proxy for the Chinese Communist Party. I think the Chinese Communist Party now have a huge degree of sway over Putin. They can bankrupt him overnight. Literally bankrupt him overnight. Now, they're not going to do that. They're too clever for that. And so I think the threat of the use of nuclear weapons recedes, because that's pretty much the last thing China would want to happen to the world. Let's hope and pray that I'm right, but it's certainly a pretty serious situation.
Let me ask you now, did your strategy in the last election of backing off, contesting those conservative seats and handing the Tories a stunning majority, being, as one writer put it, the midwife in the situation, turn out as you wished? You failed to gain office at Westminster, but contrary to what you said a moment ago, you certainly have had a very, very major and profound effect on forcing other political parties to adapt their policy position towards Europe and towards immigration. But where has it gotten you and your followers? And most importantly, where could it now go?
Look, you know what? If I hadn't done what I'd done, we'd probably have faced a second referendum and years more of political agony. It was about reversing the status quo. It was about getting the constitutional win of leaving. We've done that. Everything else they've done has been a disaster. Do I regret what I did? I'm very thoughtful about it. But we've left. We're not going to go back. We've left. We are an independent country. We may be mismanaging our affairs, but we are an independent country. So no, big picture, it was the right thing to do. But the battles to get the UK back on track will go on for years and years to come.
And with the Conservatives now having...
I'm way over time. I'm going to have to go, mate.
Okay. Can I ask you one last question?
Sure.
With the Conservatives now, so this is probably the most important question. With the Conservatives now seeming to have lost much of the gains you gave them, is your new Reform Party going to take another direction in the next general election? And will Nigel Farage finally gain a seat at the table?
I don't know. I haven't decided. Do I throw my life back into politics again? I don't know. Would I get millions of votes? Yes. But would I become the Ross Perot of the UK? Or could I break through and bust that system? The jury's out. I haven't decided. I certainly haven't ruled it out. I haven't ruled it in. For the moment, I'm broadcasting, I'm social mediaing, I'm doing my best to reach out to a wide public. And you know what? I go out to the local gas station and people stop me and want to talk. They did this morning. We'll see.
Thank you very much, Nigel.
Cheers to boy. I've got to run. I've got to run.
Thank you again.